Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode on our journey down the road to somewhere. If you happen to be joining us for the first time, we're taking a trip down Route 66 and using that as sort of a teaching device, hooking 66 stops in 8 different states into the 66 books of the Old and New Testament. So today we're in the fourth leg of our journey, and we're actually using each leg as kind of a season. And so we're in season 4, and we've really just started out this season. So we're only in the second episode of that. And as you can see, we are in the state of Oklahoma. And we are going through that section of the Old Testament where the prophets of the Old Testament are. And episode number 2, we're going to be looking at Jeremiah. And I'm calling the episode The Weeping Prophet. And you'll see a little bit later on why that was actually one of the names that had been given to Jeremiah. So again, just remember we're on fourth leg, so we've been through these states. We're right in the middle of, we're just getting into Oklahoma right now. And again, in Oklahoma, we're going to be making 17 stops because that's how many prophetic books there are in the Old Testament. Also then, we're going to divide that up into probably 5-week segments so that you'll have time to stay on top of it and catch up, and we'll give a little bit of break for Thanksgiving and Christmas time. So the first 5 weeks are referred to, and let me show you where we are in Oklahoma first. If you look up in this upper right-hand corner where the box is, I'm going to take that box and blow it up for you. And this would be that box. And last week we were in the little town of Commerce, Oklahoma, hometown of Mickey Mantle. And we are now going to be going down the road just a touch. I think it's only like 3.5, 4 miles down the road to Miami, Oklahoma. And again, last week our book was Isaiah, and it was the beginning of what are called the major prophets. This week, and actually as we go through the story line of the road to somewhere, we will be in chapter 25 of the book for those of you that are following along, and I'll kind of tell you a little bit about the story of what's going on in the book in chapter 25. And in our book of the Bible that we're going to be looking at is Jeremiah. So let me tell you a little bit, first of all, about Miami. So in the book, Joy and John have driven down now from their first Oklahoma stop and come to this town. This is a little bit bigger town than Commerce was. Miami actually has a population of about 13,000. And one of the things that it's known for in terms of Route 66 enthusiasts is that it supposedly, since Route 66 runs right down and becomes Main Street, it is supposed to have the longest main street of any main street on Route 66 that still exists, at least. In the book, as they're driving down the road, they come to an intersection of Main Street or Route 66 and Steve Owens Boulevard, and Joy asks John who Steve Owens is. She has no idea. And John tells her that he was a really good football player. As a matter of fact, I actually remember him playing for Oklahoma back when I was in high school and college. And in 1969, he won the Heisman Trophy, which was pretty unique because he was a running back. And it's kind of unusual when a running back wins the Heisman. He went on to play for the Detroit Lions and was the first Detroit Lion running back ever to surpass 1,000 yards in rushing. So he was a really good football player. And Joy, though, kind of comments, because of our comments on Mickey Mantle and the whole idea of GOAT, greatest of all time, she sort of says, not the GOAT, though. And John responds, not the GOAT. And of course, if you lived in Miami, Oklahoma, maybe you would think that he was the greatest of all time. But they continue on down the road, and Joy has done just a little bit of research on Miami, and she actually has two places that she wants to stop here in the town. One is she's thirsty and wants to get a Coke, and decides that she wants to go to Wayland's Cuckoo Burger, which is, kind of one of the attractions along Route 66 that's become quite popular. And so they stop there just for a minute and get something to drink. And then she tells John that there's also in town a place she wants to see, which is a vintage motorcycle museum. And the name of that museum was Vintage Iron. And it's kind of interesting because, of course, we know, knowing John's background from Somewhere Fast, that he's a motorcycle guy. As a matter of fact, Somewhere Fast is the story of him when he takes a trip down Route 66, but on his motorcycle. And of course, Joy still doesn't know his real background yet. She doesn't know about that. So, he kind of asks her, you ride? And she says yes. And when he asks her what she rides, she tells him she rides a Harley. And there sort of is a little bit of more of a connection between them at that point, simply because there's a camaraderie that exists among kind of all Harley riders. A little bit hard to explain, but in the book, I think there's like a paragraph that kind of talks a little bit about that. So anyway, they have this camaraderie. And by the way, unfortunately, if you were to drive Route 66 today, apparently the museum is shut down. But Joy decides that they're going to shoot the video that goes along with this stop there at the motorcycle museum, and they are kind of walking through trying to figure out where they ought to shoot the video, and they come across a perfectly restored 1917 Harley Davidson. And by the way, this is that exact motorcycle in that museum, or was at least in that museum. And so Joy wants to shoot it with John kind of standing in front of this old Harley Davidson. So they shoot the video, and John, as he normally does, introduces something about the town they're in. So he talks a little bit about Miami. One of the things that he talks about, and you might have noticed it, was there was a large gateway on Main Street there that said Gateway to Route 66, Oklahoma. So Miami claims that they're the gateway to Route 66. Not exactly sure how people up in Commerce feel about that, but at least they have that claim. And he talks a little bit about Route 66 in Main Street, and how it really feels like you're driving it in the old days, and that it's the longest Main Street stretch along Route 66. And then he introduces the museum a little bit and talks about it, and then transitions into the book that is kind of attached to this particular stop, which again, we have paired up Miami, Oklahoma with the book of Jeremiah. So John does a little bit of an introduction to Jeremiah, talks about him being the second of the major prophets. Reminds the audience again that major is not a function of chronology or of importance, but simply that these are the longest of the prophetic books. And so Jeremiah is almost as long as Isaiah, just a little bit shorter. And then he tells them that, Jeremiah was sometimes known as the weeping prophet. Now, I ought to tell you a little bit about why that is. He doesn't go into too much depth in this little video that they're shooting, but on the longer lecture that you have the link to there, I go into some detail about why. Jeremiah, and I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say this, but Jeremiah, he hated being a prophet. He was from a small town north of Jerusalem that was one of the Levitical towns that were set aside at the time that the land was divided, and he was the son of a priest, which meant that probably his destiny was to become a priest, which in those days and in Israel was sort of part of the nobility and the upper class. But he hated it, and partially because the message of Jeremiah, the word that always comes to my mind is that it's bleak, because it's primarily a message about destruction. So he hated the message, and he was hated. He was constantly abused and persecuted because God had given him this message that God was going to judge Judah and was going to judge Jerusalem specifically. Now, that tells us a little bit, by the way, of the timing of Jeremiah. And in the opening verses, Jeremiah, like many of the prophets, talks about the kings that he prophesied under, and he began his ministry under King Josiah, which actually was one of the kind of positive points in Israel's history. If Jeremiah began, he says, I think it's the 13th year of the reign of Josiah, which would have been 627 BC, and 2 years later, Jeremiah began a process of sort of cleansing the land of Judah from its idolatry, and apparently the temple had really been run down. All of this is on the longer video, but it really gives us a sense when Josiah began to make reforms in the land, one of which was to restore the temple. I guess the temple itself had been run down. And they discovered in the temple one of the scrolls of the law, which apparently, again, had, for some period of time, the nation had not had access to the law. We don't really know the background on that, but when Jeremiah got a copy of it, and many scholars believe it was probably the book of Deuteronomy, and began to read it and understand how far off they were from what God had asked of the nation of Israel, Josiah begins this reform. And that takes place about 2 years after the beginning of Jeremiah's ministry, and although the Bible doesn't say anything about it, there might be a sense that Jeremiah somehow influenced him. Although what we really get a sense of is that following Josiah, there were 4 extremely bad kings of Israel that drifted back into all kinds of idolatry and immorality and really rebellion against the nation of Babylon. They were sort of a client state of Babylon at that point in time, but were allowed to really operate quite freely. And then these kings came along that began to rebel against Babylon and also against God. And Jeremiah's message was basically that because of their sin and idolatry, that God was going to destroy Jerusalem. We're told that probably basically the first half of the book, timing-wise, takes place before the actual destruction of Jerusalem in 586, and that the second half of the book probably is after the destruction of Jerusalem. But again, Jeremiah, he hated the message he'd been given, and he was arrested, he was beaten, he was thrown into muddy cisterns and left to die. And yet, eventually, all that he had prophesied came to pass. And again, in 586 BC, actually, 2 years prior to that, about 588 BC, the Romans besieged the city, which meant that they surrounded it and wouldn't let anyone in or out. And what ended up happening when that would take place was that the city would begin to starve. They would sometimes run out of water. And so after 2 years of siege, they broke through the walls of the city and they absolutely destroyed it. They burned the whole city of Jerusalem. They burned down the temple. They knocked down all the walls, and the city was just absolutely desolate. And then they took sort of the cream of the crop into captivity. And so all of this was part of the message of Jeremiah, which also tells us, by the way, that this is about 100 years after Isaiah. There's a tradition that when the city, as the Romans were breaking into the city, that Jeremiah actually took the Ark of the Covenant and fled outside the city. There was a group that got away and headed down to Egypt and almost forced Jeremiah to go with them, but that he hid the Ark of the Covenant, and for 1,000 some years, no one knew where the Ark was. Jokingly, I thought, until Steven Spielberg discovered it in Raiders of the Lost Ark, which of course wasn't the real Ark of the Covenant, but it is kind of interesting that if you see that movie, you get a pretty good feel for what the Ark of the Covenant actually looked like. So, but woven in to the message, and I think this is real important, you'll see this as you go through the video, woven into the message was a message of hope. Like most of the prophets, there were these two pieces to the book. One is warning of coming destruction, and the other is a message about hope. And three big things that I talk about in that video in terms of hope. One is that in the book there is a hope of return from captivity. By the way, there's a confrontation that Jeremiah actually has with a prophet that was a prophet to the king Zedekiah, and he was a false prophet. He was officially a prophet, but he was sending out a message saying that God had told him that this destruction and this captivity would only last for 2 years, and that then God was going to destroy Babylon, and that Judah would be returned to the land. And Jeremiah just confronts him and tells him that he's a false prophet, that the captivity is going to actually last for 70 years. And again, the result of that, I think, is that he was thrown in prison and beaten. By the way, the 70-year message of Jeremiah shows up again in the book of Daniel. When Daniel is actually reading Jeremiah, is what we're told, and when he hits the passage where Jeremiah talks about 70 years, apparently that was pretty close to how long they had been there, because he prays, and in response to his prayer, and we'll see this when we go through the book of Daniel, God sends the angel Gabriel and gives him this timetable of everything that's getting ready to happen, from the return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of Jerusalem, all the way through the coming of Messiah, the death of Messiah, the coming of Antichrist, and the second coming of Christ. So it's quite a prophecy, and we'll look at that when we get into the book of Daniel. So, return from captivity. A second message of hope in the book is the coming of Messiah. And so there are some prophetic passages in the book that talk about that God is going to raise up a root of Jesse, and that he will be a deliverer of Judah, and so we have some prophetic pieces of the coming of Messiah there in Jeremiah. And then probably one of the most important pieces of hope that is in the book is that Jeremiah is the prophet of the new covenant. And this is really important, and it has tremendous impact not only on the time of Jeremiah, but the time of Jesus and all the way to our own time, because he talks about a day coming when God is going to replace the old covenant, which would have been the covenant of the law, with a new covenant, which will be a covenant of grace and will have to do with, rather than sort of an external religiosity, that God was actually going to write his law on people's hearts, and that there would be an internal reality of a relationship with God. And of course, when he talks about the new covenant, two things come to mind. Number one, the book of Hebrews talks a lot about if the old covenant would have been sufficient, there wouldn't have been need for a new covenant. So the fact that there was a new covenant sort of replaced the old covenant. The second thing is, you probably remember that in the upper room the night before Jesus was crucified, as they celebrated the Passover dinner together, that when Jesus took the cup after the meal, in what we replicate when we do communion, in three of the Gospels, he specifically makes mention that this cup is the new covenant in my blood. And what he's really telling his disciples is that when he goes to the cross and experiences death for the sin of humanity and is risen from the dead, that the new covenant would be established by what he did at the cross. So again, an extremely important message there in Jeremiah. John goes on, and as is usual, just briefly in the book, just encourages his audience to watch the longer video on Jeremiah. I'm going to do something a little different this week. I recently spoke on the book of Jeremiah, and normally the video that you would be watching, and I'm going to still give a link to it, and Baker will set that up. So that if you want to go and watch that, that was a teaching that I did a number of years ago, and recently I spoke at a men's group and gave a message on Jeremiah. It's a little shorter, and in some ways I think it's a little better than the message that's on the video. So I'm going to give you both links, and you can kind of decide which of them you'd like to go to as you look a little deeper into this book that is so important, not only again to the Israelites, the tribe of Judah at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, which was such a key event in their history, but also is so important to us today as we live in relationship with Jesus and are able to live under a new covenant. So I encourage you to watch those videos, and thanks for being with us today in our short time together, and we'll look forward to next week, where we'll actually be with Jeremiah again, but in a book called Lamentations, that basically is Jeremiah's response to looking over the destruction of Jerusalem. It's kind of a sad book. It's a very short book, but that'll be what we take a look at next week together. So thanks for tuning in today to this episode, and we'll see you next week.